The stone was cold beneath her feet, colder than the morning air, colder than the hands that dragged her forward. She was only 8, still small enough to stumble on her own dress, still young enough to whisper to dolls in secret. But that day, she wasn't a child anymore. That day, she was property. The hall echoed with footsteps that didn't belong to her. The walls swallowed her cries before they could leave her lips. And when the door closed, the world forgot she existed. Enslaved at 8, forgotten at 13. History buried her before she even lived. But history has a habit of underestimating girls like her, because the same silence that erased her would one day crown her, not with jewels, not with gold, but with fear. She was forgotten before she was grown, yet remembered as the woman who bent France to her will, without ever wearing a crown. This is not the story you'll find in textbooks. This is not the story your teachers told. This is the story they tried to erase, the story whispered in shadows, the story of France's shadow queen. And if you're here, listening, it means her voice has finally found you. So listen carefully, because this is the story they never wanted you to hear. France in the late Middle Ages was a kingdom dressed in silk, but stitched together with fear. Kings played chess with entire provinces, nobles with entire families. And when debts piled high, when alliances needed sealing, when power needed proof, children were the pieces sacrificed first. At 8 years old, she was still a child of laughter. She chased birds in the yard until her skirts tangled. She skipped stones, counted clouds, whispered secrets to dolls she hid under her bed. Her world was still small, fragile, filled with the innocence of someone who believed tomorrow would always be hers. But in France, tomorrow wasn't promised. It was traded, sold, signed away with ink and seal. One morning, she woke to find her world gone. Her parents' faces, proud, stiff, greedy. Their eyes didn't hold love that day, only relief. Because she wasn't their daughter anymore. She was a bargain, a settlement, a key to doors they could not open on their own. The betrayal cut deeper than chains. A mother who braided her hair now handed her over like property. A father who once lifted her onto his shoulders now lifted a goblet to toast the man who would own her. They called it duty. They called it security. But to her, it felt like burial. 8 years old, still with milk teeth, still with laughter trapped inside her lungs, and yet forced to stand silent as hands measured her for a dress that wasn't hers, a life that wasn't hers, a cage she could not escape. From that day on, she learned what it meant to be owned. Every step corrected, every breath monitored, every glance punished. Don't speak unless spoken to. Don't move unless permitted. Don't dream at all. The dolls disappeared, the games forgotten. Her laughter became dangerous. Her silence became survival. Meals were eaten after others had finished. Her hands folded until they ached. Her eyes fixed on the floor, never daring to rise too high. The rules were endless, but the lesson was simple. She was no longer a child. She was property. And property doesn't ask why. Property doesn't resist. Property doesn't hope. At 8 years old, she buried herself alive. The girl who once skipped stones was lowered into silence. The child who once believed in love learned the cruelest truth of all, that the people who should have protected her were the ones who sold her first. By 13, she was already gone, not dead, not buried, but invisible. She walked through her own home like a ghost. Rooms full of voices carried on without noticing her. Her chair at the table was filled by a body, not a person. Her name spoken rarely and only as command. She was there, but not seen. Alive, but not living. Every mistake was branded as defiance. Every glance called insolence. Every word punished. If she laughed, too loud. If she breathed, too heavy. If she looked where she shouldn't. If she spoke before she was summoned. If she existed outside the narrow cage built for her. Correction followed. Correction, they called it. Correction instead of cruelty. Correction instead of abuse. A welt across the shoulder became a lesson. Bruised lips explained as discipline. Eyes swollen shut framed as obedience training. And the worst part, the house agreed. The servants whispered behind closed doors. But when he passed, they bowed. They dabbed her wounds with cold water and colder words. It could be worse. We must have given him reason. Better him than someone else. Even women who should have known better turned away, because in their world silence was safer than truth. So she stopped asking questions, not because she didn't have any, but because answers always came with pain. She learned the rules. Don't laugh. Don't run. Don't cry where eyes can see. Don't exist more than required. Day by day, piece by piece, the child was erased. The girl who once dreamed of fields and stories was hollowed out, replaced with something quieter, something safer. By 13, she no longer belonged to herself. She belonged to silence. But silence is never empty. In the quiet, she began to hear things others didn't. The quiver in a steward's voice when lying. The hesitation in a noble's hand when hiding guilt. The cracks in laughter that carried fear. Invisible to them, she saw everything. Unnoticed, she noticed all, and while the world forgot her, she was beginning to remember, not who she was, but what she could become. The girl they erased at 13 was not gone. She was listening. She was waiting. She was learning. And one day, they would regret underestimating the ghost in their halls. Silence was supposed to break her. Instead, it became her weapon. When words were stripped away, she learned to listen. And in listening, she discovered something no one had meant to teach her. Power doesn't begin with strength. It begins with secrets. And secrets live in the spaces between words. At 13, while they dismissed her as a ghost, she was already training. Not with swords, not with books, but with eyes and ears. She sat at tables where men argued over taxes, inheritances, alliances. They thought her presence meaningless. They forgot she could hear, and so she learned. The noble who laughed too loudly when he lied, the bishop who sipped wine while pretending to fast, the steward who flinched each time a certain name was spoken. She noticed what others missed. She remembered what others forgot. Every gesture, stored. Every hesitation, recorded. Every secret, memorized. Her silence unnerved them. A girl who didn't giggle, didn't interrupt, didn't chatter like others her age. She simply watched. And the longer she watched, the more they shifted in their seats, uneasy beneath her steady gaze. Sometimes, without meaning to, her silence spoke louder than words. When a joke fell cruel, she didn't laugh. When a command carried arrogance, she didn't move quickly enough. Not rebellion, not defiance, just absence. And somehow, that absence unsettled them more than any argument could. One evening at dinner, a lord made a cutting remark. The table chuckled. Her husband smirked. She remained silent, eyes steady, cup lifted. And in that pause, long, sharp, deliberate, the laughter died quicker than it began. They called her obedient. They thought she was docile. But her silence was no longer submission. It was strategy. And in that strategy, she was becoming dangerous. The walls of the court became her classroom, the whispers of the servants, her textbooks, the arrogance of men, her daily lessons. She studied them with precision. How long before a boast turned into a confession? How long before a smile slipped into fear? How long before a glance revealed more than a speech? While they believed she was harmless, she was mapping them. While they believed she was invisible, she was memorizing them. And by the time they realized she was more than a shadow, it would already be too late. Because the silent child they thought they buried was slowly, carefully, becoming France's most dangerous apprentice. She learned young that survival was never about strength. Strength bruises, strength shouts, strength burns out. Survival was about patience, precision, shadows. By 14, her silence was no longer passive. It was deliberate, measured, calculated. She began with the smallest of manipulations, a letter delayed, just long enough to change a meeting, a servant encouraged to speak freely, only to discover their words were repeated in exactly the wrong ears, a compliment given to a man's pride at the precise moment he craved it most, binding him to her without his knowing. She gave little, but received everything. A raised eyebrow, a careful nod, a sigh timed perfectly at the end of a discussion. She said almost nothing, yet entire decisions bent subtly in her favour. Men who believed themselves leaders left conversations convinced she admired them. They did not see that she had planted their choices before they even spoke. She was not on the throne, she was not named regent, and yet slowly nobles began to seek her. A widow with a debt, a steward with a dispute, a bishop with a guilty conscience. They arrived quietly, certain she could not refuse to listen. And when they left, they carried the weight of a secret understanding that she could ruin them or protect them. It began with a disappearance. A man who had once mocked her too openly at a feast, suddenly sent abroad, no explanation, no letters. Then a cousin who had pressed too close, disgraced, stripped of land. Then the priest who signed her childhood away at 8 years old, gone. No burial, no trace. She never lifted a hand, never raised her voice, never touched a blade. But each absence left a shadow shaped like her, and whispers began to spread. She knows something. She hears everything. She is listening, even now. France's whisper network bent toward her. Confessions spoken in candlelight. Secrets sealed in letters that mysteriously found their way into her hands. Favours exchanged behind curtains. Oaths whispered not to king or priest, but to her. She became the ear no one could avoid, the silence everyone feared, the shadow behind decisions that nobles signed with trembling hands. At court, they said she was well behaved, that she was obedient, that she was still, always still. But stillness is its own form of power, because stillness unnerves the restless. Stillness forces others to fill the silence. Stillness makes them speak, and in speaking, they reveal everything. Men underestimated her once. They thought her voiceless. They thought her tamed. And one by one, those men disappeared. No law named her queen, no ceremony crowned her, yet she ruled just the same, through secrets, through silence, through absence. By 16, even her husband hesitated before crossing her, not out of love, not even out of fear, but out of calculation, because he knew she remembered everything. And so France began to bend, not to the king, not to the throne, but to the girl they had forgotten at 13, the one who now carried silence like a crown. The halls of power shifted when she entered. Men lowered their voices, women leaned closer, guards straightened at doors, not for her rank, but for her presence. She didn't demand, she didn't beg, she didn't command, she simply existed. An existence in her hands was enough to terrify an entire kingdom. From property to presence, from shadow to force, She was no longer ignored, she was feared, and in the fear she inspired, she discovered something far greater than survival. She discovered rule. Power changes everything, not quickly, not loudly, but slowly, in the way people look at you. The man who once struck her without hesitation now paused before raising his voice. The hand that had dragged her through corridors now lingered, uncertain, before resting on her arm. The husband who once made decisions over her head now asked, quietly, carefully, "What do you think?" It was not respect, not affection, but calculation. He knew her silence was dangerous. He knew she heard what others whispered in shadows, and though he never admitted it, he feared what she might do with what she knew. This was victory, but it was not joy, because even as her influence spread, she remained alone. Not a wife in truth, not a child long since buried, not a mother, not a lover, not a friend, but a presence, an echo that filled rooms without ever belonging to them. She was invited everywhere, welcomed nowhere. Men bowed but never embraced. Women whispered but never confided. Servants moved quickly in her sight, but never smiled in her presence. She had traded bruises for obedience, obedience for silence, silence for power. But what was power without someone to share it with? There is a rumour, one no record confirms, yet no story erases, that one night, long after the torches had been extinguished, she slipped into the chapel alone. No crown, no jewels, no silks, just a woman in plain dress kneeling on cold stone, the candle before her guttered and died, plunging the room into shadow. And for the first time in years, she let herself weep, not loudly, not with sobs, just silently, as she always had. Tears that left no trace, prayers that never left her lips. No one dared interrupt, no one dared ask, but the guards outside swore they heard nothing, and still knew everything. When she rose again, her face was dry, her back straight, her silence once more unbreakable. The child who'd been sold at 8 still lived inside her. The forgotten girl at 13 still haunted her, and no matter how many nobles bowed, no matter how many whispers feared her name, that child was the one she could never silence. She left the chapel not as a woman broken, but as a monument, a figure carved from sorrow, sharpened by survival, crowned not by gold, but by the cost of everything she had lost, triumph and tragedy woven into one. For she had won power, but she had paid for it with peace. They never crowned her. They never named her queen. And yet, in whispers, in rumours, in the trembling hands of couriers delivering sealed letters, she was more powerful than most who ever wore a crown. Nobles began to call her the woman behind the throne. They said nothing moved in France without her quiet approval, that her silence carried more weight than the king's words. Servants told stories of her eyes, how a single glance could ruin a man's fortune, end a career, silence a rival. They spoke of her as if she were both blessing and curse, protection and punishment, saint and spectre. And in a way, she was. No crown adorned her head, no throne bore her weight, but no one challenged her. No one dared, because France did not remember her as a queen. France remembered her as something far more unsettling, a presence, a force, a shadow that shaped the light around it. She was enslaved at 8, forgotten at 13, but remembered forever as France's shadow queen. If her voice has reached you now, it is because history failed to silence her. If her story lingers in your mind, it is because they tried to erase her, and still she endures. So listen, remember, and share her story, so the forgotten are forgotten no longer. Like, comment, subscribe, not for me, but for her. for the shadows who still wait to be heard.